It begins, as most disasters in modern Japan begin, with a number nobody believes. On the night of August 13th, 2026, the rain gauges in Chiba Prefecture recorded a figure that made meteorologists stop and check their own instruments. 351 millimeters of rain in a single day. Not in a month, not in a season. In one day, at one station, in a country that has been measuring rainfall since 1966. The previous record for that same station was 259 millimeters. This was not a broken record. This was a record shattered by nearly 100 millimeters, an amount of water that, under normal circumstances, would take Chiba more than 2 weeks to receive. It fell in 12 hours. And it fell during the 1 week of the year when the highways, the train platforms, and the airport terminals of eastern Japan are at their absolute fullest, because it was Obon, the Buddhist holiday, when tens of millions of people leave the cities and travel home to be with their families and the spirits of their ancestors. Nobody plans a catastrophe around a national migration. But that is exactly what the sky delivered. By the time the sun rose over Tokyo Bay on the morning of August 14th, the prefecture that had spent the previous evening simply commuting home was instead wading through it. Streets in Chiba City had become brown, moving rivers, carrying cars, bicycles, and debris past shop fronts that had never in their history seen water above the doorstep. Drains that were engineered for the rainfall patterns of the 20th century were overwhelmed within the first hour of the deluge, unable to swallow water that was arriving faster than any drainage system built decades ago could have been designed to handle. And somewhere in that darkness, in cars stopped on flooded roads and homes where the water rose faster than anyone expected, people began to die. The story that unfolds from here is not simply a weather story. It is a story about what happens when a modern, wealthy, highly organized society, one of the most disaster-prepared nations on Earth, is confronted with a volume of water that exceeds every historical benchmark it has ever used to plan for the worst. It is a story about a governor standing in front of cameras, visibly shaken, saying words that Japanese officials almost never say out loud, that he had never seen anything like this before. It is a story about an international airport transformed overnight into an emergency shelter for thousands of stranded travelers. And it is a story about a country now being forced to ask an uncomfortable question. If this is what one storm looks like in 2026, what does the next one look like? To understand how such a catastrophe unfolded, you have to understand the geography and the timing, because both conspired against Chiba in ways that turned an intense storm into a historic emergency. Chiba Prefecture sits just east of Tokyo, wrapping around the eastern side of Tokyo Bay, home to millions of residents and to Narita International Airport, one of the busiest gateways not just to Japan, but to all of East Asia. Late on the evening of Thursday, August 13th, a band of extremely intense rain formed over the prefecture and, critically, stalled there. It did not move through quickly the way a typical summer storm system does. It sat, feeding on warm, moisture-laden air, and it kept dumping rain on the same drainage basins, the same rivers, the same urban streets, hour after hour after hour. Meteorologists have a term for this kind of behavior, a stationary or quasi-stationary rain band, sometimes called a linear precipitation zone in Japanese forecasting language, and it is precisely this kind of system that has been responsible for some of the deadliest flash flooding events in Japan's recent history. When a storm moves, the damage spreads out and softens. When a storm stops, the damage concentrates and compounds. Chiba got a storm that stopped. In the span of a single hour, Chiba City recorded 115 millimeters of rainfall, a new record for that location, 1 hour's worth of rain that many places on Earth do not see in an entire month. Sakura, a city in the northern part of the prefecture, saw 97 millimeters in that same hour, another all-time record. By the time the Japan Meteorological Agency had finished tallying the overnight totals, some locations across the prefecture had recorded between 360 and 367 millimeters of rain within 24 hours, surpassing even the previous regional benchmark that had been set back in 2013. This was, in the language of hydrologists, a rainfall event with a return period measured not in years, but in many decades, possibly longer. The kind of storm that statistical models suggest should occur perhaps once in a lifetime, if that. At 7:30 in the evening, as the rain intensified and rivers began climbing toward their banks, the Japan Meteorological Agency issued something Chiba Prefecture had never received before in its recorded history. A Level 5 emergency warning for heavy rain, the highest classification on Japan's disaster alert scale. Level 5 does not mean prepare to evacuate. Level 5 means the disaster is already happening, or is so imminent that evacuation instructions may no longer be safely followed, and residents should simply take whatever action preserves their life immediately, wherever they are. It is the alert level reserved for situations in which authorities are, in effect, telling the public that the system built to warn them in advance has run out of runway. More than 20 municipalities across the prefecture were placed under this warning simultaneously, an almost unheard of geographic scale for Japan's most severe classification. The cruelty of the timing cannot be overstated. This was the middle of Open Week, one of the 2 or 3 busiest travel periods on the entire Japanese calendar. A week when highways swell with families driving to ancestral hometowns and train stations fill with return migration on a scale that rivals the New Year holiday. A Level 5 warning was issued into a population that was not sitting safely at home. It was issued into a population already in motion, on expressways, on local roads, inside train carriages, standing on platforms waiting for connections. A flood warning reaching people in transit is a fundamentally different and far more dangerous situation than a flood warning reaching people who are already indoors and can simply move upstairs. And it was precisely this, people caught in vehicles and on roads at the exact moment the water arrived, that would come to define the human cost of the disaster. As the night deepened, the water did not simply pool, it moved with force along roads that were never designed to be riverbeds but became them anyway. Rivers across the prefecture began surging past their danger thresholds. The prefectural disaster headquarters recorded Level 4 flood danger status, 1 step below outright flood occurrence, on 8 separate rivers simultaneously, an indication of just how widely the deluge was distributed across the region rather than concentrated in a single watershed. And on the Murata River, the water crossed the final threshold entirely. Monitoring cameras confirmed what officials had feared. The river had breached, flood occurrence status had been reached, and the water that had been contained within its banks only hours earlier was now spreading into the streets and neighborhoods around it. By the early hours of Friday morning, the human toll began to register, first in fragments, then in a grim, climbing total that seemed to grow with every news cycle. Reuters reported 4 confirmed deaths on Friday morning. By midday, Japan's national broadcaster NHK was reporting 6. By early afternoon, Chiba's prefectural government had confirmed the final toll for that phase of the disaster. 8 people dead, spread across 5 cities, 3 in Chiba City itself, 2 in the city of Sakura, and 1 each in Ichikawa, Kashiwa, and Yachiyo. 4 more people were treated for injuries. Officials were careful and honest in how they described the pattern behind these deaths. Several of them, they said, involved flooded roads or vehicles caught in rapidly rising water, people who had been driving or who had been in cars that stalled in what looked like shallow water and became death traps within minutes as the current strengthened and the depth climbed past the doors. It is one of the oldest and most repeated warnings in flood safety, in Japan and everywhere else in the world. And it is one of the hardest warnings for a driver in the dark, mid-journey, mid-holiday, to actually obey in the moment. Turn around, don't drown. On the night of August 13th, that warning arrived for many people too late, or not at all. While the rivers rose and the death toll climbed, an entirely different kind of chaos was unfolding roughly 40 kilometers away, at Narita International Airport, the primary gateway not only for the greater Tokyo region, but for a significant share of all international travel into Japan. Narita sits in Chiba Prefecture itself, which meant the airport was not a safe distance from the disaster. It was inside it. As access roads flooded and rail lines connecting the airport to central Tokyo were suspended, thousands of travelers found themselves stranded, unable to leave the terminal, unable to reach their hotels, unable to complete journeys that had, for many of them, already spanned continents. Estimates of those stuck overnight ranged as high as 7,000 people. Airport staff, working through the night, distributed sleeping bags, bottled water, and snacks to travelers who were now sleeping on terminal floors, in departure lounges, wherever there was space, watching the flight boards and the weather reports with equal anxiety. Flights themselves were largely spared major disruption. By Friday, operations at Narita were reported to be running normally, but the ground transportation collapse around the airport turned what should have been a routine holiday travel night into an improvised, uncomfortable vigil for thousands of exhausted people with nowhere else to go. The chaos was not confined to the airport. At Soga train station, elsewhere in the flood zone, roughly 4,000 people were left stranded by rising water, trapped for hours as rail services around them were suspended and the surrounding streets became impassable. Japan's ground self-defense force was deployed to evacuate them, a scene that speaks to just how quickly an ordinary evening commute during a holiday week collapsed into a military-assisted rescue operation. Hundreds more people, unable to reach their homes or unwilling to risk the flooded roads to get there, sought shelter overnight inside the Chiba Prefectural Government building itself, turning the seat of regional administration into an impromptu evacuation center. By 6 o'clock on the morning of August 14th, more than 7,300 people were sheltering across 359 designated sites spread across 39 municipalities, a number that captures just how far the emergency had spread, touching not one town or one river basin, but nearly the entire populated breadth of the prefecture at once. Behind the human displacement, the infrastructure of daily life was failing in quieter but equally consequential ways. Floodwater entered electrical substations across the affected area, and Tokyo Electric Power Company reported that outages at their peak affected more than 20,000 households, cutting power to homes at the exact moment when residents most needed light, communication, and information about what to do next. Gas supplies to thousands of additional households were temporarily interrupted as well, compounding the disruption for families already dealing with flooded ground floors, ruined belongings, and the disorientation of a night that had unfolded nothing like they expected when they left for work or set out on their holiday travels the previous afternoon. Dozens of homes across Ichikawa, Kashiwa, Sakura, and Chiba City itself suffered flooding either above or below floor level, a distinction that, in Japan's disaster classification system, matters enormously for how quickly a family's life can return to something resembling normal, since above-floor flooding typically means the loss of flooring, furniture, and often the structural integrity of the lower level of a home. Government response moved with the scale the emergency demanded, but even that response revealed the strain the storm had placed on the system. Roughly 230,000 residents across Chiba Prefecture were advised to prepare to evacuate, while approximately 102,600 were placed under formal evacuation orders, numbers that, taken together, meant close to 1/3 people were, in some form, told by their government that the place they were standing was not safe. In a prefecture where the recommended action for so many people was essentially to stop moving and wait, the sheer scale of displacement, layered on top of a holiday week already defined by mass movement, created a kind of double paralysis. People who had been trying to get somewhere were now being told not to go anywhere at all. It was into this scene, on Friday morning, that Chiba Governor Toshihito Kumagai stood before reporters and said the words that would be quoted around the world by the day's end. This case was an extremely unusual situation, even by Japan's historical weather standards, he told the assembled press, and then, more strikingly, he added, "I have responded to many disasters in the past, but I have never experienced a case like this." For an American or a European audience, a governor admitting he has never experienced a disaster of this magnitude might read as candor, even reassurance, an honest acknowledgement of an extraordinary event. But in the context of Japanese public administration, where officials are trained from the earliest stages of their careers to project calm, competence, and continuity even in crisis, and where disaster response protocols are among the most rehearsed and codified in the world, a statement like Kumagai's lands very differently. It is an admission that the playbook, decades in the making, refined after earthquakes, after tsunamis, after countless typhoons, did not fully anticipate a storm that behaved the way this one did. It is the sound of a system built for the worst-case scenarios of the last 50 years encountering something the last 50 years never quite prepared it for. As Friday afternoon wore on, the acute phase of the emergency began, slowly and unevenly, to recede. The Japan Meteorological Agency downgraded its unprecedented Level 5 warning down to Level 4 as the rain bands finally moved off and the immediate threat of catastrophic ongoing rainfall eased. Across the prefectural disaster portal, municipality after municipality began lifting their evacuation measures through the course of the day. Inzai lifted its order at 5:10 in the afternoon, Ichihara at 4:48, Wamashirasato at 3:35. A rolling, staggered return to normalcy that mirrored the equally staggered, chaotic way the disaster itself had unfolded across dozens of towns and cities simultaneously the night before. Chiba City, which had absorbed some of the heaviest rainfall and the worst of the fatalities, kept its own Level 4 evacuation order in place longer than most, a sign of just how much saturated, unstable ground and swollen waterways remained even after the sky itself had cleared. Because that, meteorologists were quick to caution, was the next danger, and it is one of the least visible but most persistent threats after any historic rainfall event. The rain may stop, the rivers may recede, the sun may even come out, but the ground itself does not forget 360 millimeters of water overnight. Saturated hillsides across Chiba remained at elevated risk of landslides for days after the storm passed, since soil that has absorbed that much water loses cohesion and can give way with little additional warning, sometimes hours or even days after the rain that triggered the instability has already moved on. Japanese disaster authorities, mindful of this delayed onset danger, continued to warn residents in hillside and low-lying areas to stay alert even as the headlines shifted from flooding to recovery. A flood is a single, dramatic night. A landslide risk is a slow-burning aftershock that can strike a family days after they believe the danger had passed, which is precisely why officials refused to declare the crisis fully over, even as the water itself began to recede from the streets. Stepping back from the immediate scenes of stranded travelers and flooded roads, This event fits into a pattern that Japan's climate scientists and disaster planners have been warning about with increasing urgency for years. Japan sits at the convergence of powerful, moisture-rich air masses. And as global sea and air temperatures rise, the atmosphere's capacity to hold and then release water in short, violent bursts has been steadily increasing across the entire Pacific Basin, not just in Japan, but across much of coastal East Asia. The scientific term for this is straightforward, even if the consequences are anything but. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, and when that moisture is finally released, it tends to be released faster and more intensely than the historical record would suggest is normal. Chiba's record of 351 millimeters in a day, a mark that had stood since observations began in 1966, was not broken by a small margin. It was obliterated by nearly 100 millimeters, the kind of gap between an old record and a new one that statisticians describe as a genuine outlier, an event that does not simply extend the existing trend line but jumps clean off it. This is far from an isolated Japanese phenomenon, and the broader pattern is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes what happened in Chiba from a single unlucky storm into a data point in something much larger. In the years leading up to this event, Japan had already experienced a string of increasingly extreme, increasingly localized downpours, the kind of intense hour-by-hour rainfall bursts that Japanese meteorologists have taken to calling guerrilla rainstorms for the way they appear, with little warning and strike with disproportionate concentrated force. Urban drainage infrastructure across Japan, much of it engineered in the mid to late 20th century according to the rainfall statistics of that era, is increasingly being asked to handle storms that simply did not exist, statistically speaking, when those systems were designed. Every city built its drains, its river channels, and its floodplain zoning around a certain assumption of how much rain a worst-case storm could realistically deliver. Chiba's disaster suggests, starkly, that assumption may now need to be revised upward, and not only in Chiba, but in dense, low-lying coastal prefectures across the country, many of which share the same aging drainage infrastructure and the same vulnerability to a storm that simply refuses to move on. There's also a harder, more uncomfortable layer to this story, one that goes beyond meteorology and into the realities of a country whose population skews older than almost any other on Earth. Japan's demographic profile, one of the oldest societies in the world, with a rapidly shrinking working-age population, adds a dimension to disaster response that younger, faster-growing nations simply do not have to contend with in the same way. Elderly residents, who make up an outsized share of the population in many of Chiba's smaller municipalities, are statistically far more vulnerable in flash flooding events, less able to move quickly to higher ground, less able to physically navigate rapidly rising water on foot, and, in many cases, less connected to the smartphone-based alert systems that increasingly form the backbone of Japan's modern early warning infrastructure. As Japan's population continues to age over the coming decades, disaster planners are increasingly forced to grapple with the reality that the country's most vulnerable citizens to climate-driven flash floods are also, disproportionately, its oldest ones, a demographic reality colliding with a climate reality, each one compounding the danger posed by the other. And then there is the economic layer, the one that rarely makes the first paragraph of a news report, but that determines how long a disaster's shadow actually lasts. Chiba Prefecture is not a marginal rural backwater. It is one of the most economically significant regions in the entire country, home to major industrial zones, agricultural land that supplies produce to the greater Tokyo metropolitan area, and, of course, Narita International Airport itself, a critical node not just for Japanese travel, but for regional and even global logistics and trade. A multi-day disruption to an airport of that scale carries ripple effects far beyond the stranded travelers sleeping on terminal floors. Cargo delays, missed connections, rippling across international schedules, and reputational costs for a country that has long marketed itself, accurately, as one of the most reliable, well-organized travel destinations in the world. The flooding of agricultural land in the prefecture, meanwhile, threatens crop losses that will not be fully understood for weeks, arriving at a moment when Japan, like much of the world, is already navigating elevated food and import costs. As the water recedes and the cleanup begins in earnest, the questions facing Chiba and facing Japan more broadly are no longer just about this single storm. They are about what comes next. Will drainage infrastructure across the prefecture and across comparable low-lying coastal regions nationwide be re-engineered to handle rainfall totals that now sit within the realm of documented possibility rather than theoretical extremity? Will Japan's early warning systems be adjusted to better reach populations who are traveling, in transit, or otherwise outside the reach of home-based alert infrastructure during peak holiday periods, given how directly the timing of this disaster compounded its lethality? Will the country's insurance and disaster relief frameworks, already strained by a rising frequency of what used to be called once-in-a-generation events, be able to keep pace with a climate in which once-in-a-generation storms appear to be arriving with unsettling and increasing regularity? None of these questions have easy answers, and none of them will be resolved in the days or even months immediately following this particular flood. International coverage of the disaster arrived quickly and, in its own way, told a second story layered on top of the first. Major outlets around the world, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Reuters, CNA, ABC, CBC, all picked up the images out of Narita within hours, and the detail that seemed to travel fastest, the one that made the story instantly legible to audiences who had never heard of Chiba Prefecture before that week, was the airport. A modern international hub, the kind of place associated in the public imagination with sleek efficiency and seamless connections, reduced overnight to rows of exhausted travelers on sleeping bags handed out by airport staff, waiting for trains that were not running and roads that were underwater. It is one thing to describe river flooding. In a prefecture, most foreign audiences cannot place on a map. It is another thing entirely to show the world an airport most of them have personally passed through, transformed into an emergency shelter. That image did more to communicate the scale of the event globally than any rainfall statistic could have on its own, and it is part of why a regional Japanese flooding story became, within a single news cycle, a genuinely international one. On the ground, away from the cameras at Narita, the individual stories that emerged from the flood zone carried the kind of detail that statistics alone cannot hold. Rescue teams described roads that had been ordinary residential streets the previous afternoon, now running with a current strong enough to move parked vehicles sideways into fences and shop fronts. Firefighters and self-defense force personnel worked through the overnight hours in inflatable boats and wading gear, moving door to door through some of the worst-hit blocks in Chiba City and Ichikawa, checking on elderly residents who had not evacuated, some because they had not received warnings in time, others because they had simply never imagined water reaching the second step of their own front door. In several of the hardest-hit residential blocks, rescue crews reported reaching homes where families had already moved themselves and their most essential belongings to the highest point available, a kitchen counter, a stairwell landing, a rooftop, and were simply waiting in the dark for the water outside to stop climbing. It is these quieter, undocumented hours, multiplied across hundreds of homes simultaneously, that rarely make it into an official death toll or a damage estimate, but that constitute the lived human center of a disaster like this one. There is also the matter of how this event will be remembered institutionally, inside the very disaster management agencies now tasked with studying it. Japan has built, arguably, the most sophisticated disaster response and early warning apparatus of any nation on Earth, forged and continually refined through decades of earthquakes, tsunamis, and typhoons that gave the country little choice but to take preparedness seriously as a matter of national survival. That apparatus performed, in many respects, exactly as designed on the night of August 13th. Warnings were issued, evacuation orders were declared with real specificity down to the municipality. The self-defense force mobilized rapidly to pull 4,000 people out of a single flooded train station, and shelters opened across 39 separate municipalities within hours. And yet 8 people still died, mostly in vehicles, mostly on roads, that the system's own warnings had told them, in effect, to avoid. This is the uncomfortable lesson that Japanese disaster researchers will almost certainly spend the coming months studying in detail. Even a warning system operating at full effectiveness cannot fully protect a population that is, by the accident of the calendar, already in motion when the warning arrives. Obon Week did not cause the rain. But Obon Week very likely shaped who lived and who did not, because a family safely at home can climb a staircase, and a family on an expressway at 9 at night cannot. What is certain, as of this telling, is the shape of what already happened. 8 confirmed deaths across 5 cities, thousands stranded overnight at one of Asia's busiest airports, 4,000 more evacuated from a single train station by military personnel, close to 1/3 of a million residents told to evacuate or prepare to, tens of thousands of households without power, a river breaching its banks on camera for the world to see, and a governor standing before reporters admitting, in a country built on institutional composure, that he had simply never seen anything like it. The rain that fell on Chiba on the night of August 13th, 2026, did not just break a 60-year-old record. It exposed, in the span of 12 brutal hours, exactly how much strain a modern, wealthy, meticulously prepared nation can be put under when the sky simply refuses to follow the patterns it was built to expect. The water has begun to recede from the streets of Chiba. Whether the systems built to prevent the next one will rise to meet what is coming is a question the rest of this decade will keep asking, storm by storm, record by record, city by city, until an answer finally arrives.